Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Nice to have you all at the session today. I'd like to have Jessica Bissett Perea go ahead and take over the show.
Great, yes. Good morning, good evening, and welcome again to the inaugural Asia Pacific Studies Seminar Series hosted by the APRU Indigenous Knowledges Working Group. As was just mentioned, my name is Jessica Bissett Perea. I'm a Dena'ina, Alaska Dena musician scholar, and I work as an associate professor at University of California, Davis in the United States. And I'll be serving as the moderator for today's presentations. As you may have seen on the seminar website, our objective is to provide a forum for sharing works in progress and networking researchers committed to working with, by, and for Indigenous peoples across the Asia-Pacific region. And the five-part series offers presentations from scholars working in a broad array of academic fields and on everything from place-based research, teaching and pedagogy to related topics such as tonight's theme of unsettling indigeneities. And I want to start also by, if you need more information, I will put in the chat here a link to the seminar website. And I'd also like to quickly thank the APRU Network and Programs administrators, Jackie Wong and Anya Wong, as well as the APRU Indigenous Knowledges Working Group co-chairs, Professor Adrienne Little and Adriana Rojas, and as well as my colleagues and seminar co-facilitators, Patricia Riget and Waylene Jeffrey Giom. For your information, I'll also post here in the chat the agenda. So in about 1 minute, we'll start with the first presentation. But first, I'd like to give an introduction to Dr. Brian Klopotek. Is an associate professor and department head for the Department of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies, at the University of Oregon in the United States. His previous work examines indigeneity and race among non-federal and federal tribes in Louisiana in the United States, and work is animated by his own non-federal Choctaw heritage from there. His current project examines constructions of indigeneity and race relationality in the U.S. and Mexico, and drawing on his work with the Choctaw Apache tribe in Louisiana and his time as a Fulbright U.S. Studies Chair at the Universidad de las Americas Puebla in Cholula, Puebla, Mexico. So please help me welcome Dr. Klopotek.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share this research with you and talk about this important work and these important projects that we share interest in. Thank you for that introduction. And it's funny because I said that stuff and then I forgot what I wrote. So yeah, that's what I'll talk about today. I had the good fortune to be a Fulbright scholar in Mexico for a year. And as I begin, I actually want to tell you where this project begins, which was that I was working with the Choctaw Apache tribe, also in Sabine Parish, where my family is from, and working with them on their federal acknowledgement case. And in the United States, there's a formal process that petitioners can go through to become federally recognized. And in that process that's been around since 1978, there's a series of kind of research demands that are put upon tribes to demonstrate that they are indeed indigenous polities that have continued to exist from the time before the US existed into the present. And so there's a challenge, some of the rules seem very basic and straightforward, just, prove you're a tribe. But the way that those rules come up against the ways we talk about race and indigeneity in the United States creates some significant barriers for certain groups of people in certain ways. And so in the United States, the things I've written about before is the ways that Blackness comes into the discussion. So if someone has African ancestry, or a group has African ancestry, they're much more likely to have been identified as Black by people around them because of racial rules in the United States. We call it the one-drop rule, or the rule of hypodescent, meaning that any African ancestry makes you Black, no matter what other ancestry you have. For the Choctaw Apache tribe, they're in a position where, as they submitted their initial petition for federal acknowledgement, the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs response was essentially to say, like, well, we think you might be Mexican, not Indian. And so they run up against these rules about race, like what makes someone Mexican versus Indian. And they have indigenous ancestry from both sides of what's now the US-Mexico border. And they're also a Spanish language heritage community. And so they're kind of caught up in this in a way that other people don't have to worry about. But the question of how, of what it means to be Indian in the US and what it means to be Mexican in the US, as well as what it means to be Indian and Mexican in Mexico, come to bear on their petition for federal acknowledgement. And so as I started working with them, and this is where they're located, this is Sabine Parish in Louisiana, which is in southeastern United States. As I started working with them, it became clear that I needed to be able to not only speak and read and all that in Spanish, but do it historically. So what does it mean if a historical record in the 1700s says Indian or mestizo or lobo or these other racial categories? And I needed to understand the cultural elements of that. So not just the word itself, but what did people imply by it? And how did one come to be classified as Indian or as mestizo? And what are those, how do those relate to each other? So my basic premise is that indigeneity is constructed. And this is something that when we talk about it in studies of race, everybody in the US would say, of course, race is constructed. It's a social construction. It's not essential. It's something that, you know, we assign meaning to particular biological features and ancestries. But when we think of indigeneity in Native studies in the US, this makes people very, makes us queasy. Like, what do you mean? No, it's a real thing, you know. But to say something is constructed is not to say that it's not real. It's to say that the reality of it is made by humans and it has real effects. And so I started working with the Choctaw Apache tribe, and they gave me all these documents. They gave me like 10,000 pages of documents to work through, and I've been talking with them, working most closely with Robert Caldwell here, who's been a tribal council member and also their recognition coordinator. But I felt I felt unprepared to be able to talk about those, you know, what it means to be Indian in Mexico, as someone who's been raised in the US and does Native studies in a US context primarily. And so I thought it would be important to spend some time in Mexico. And I really wanted to think, to get familiar first with the national culture of Mexico. How is indigeneity constructed within the national culture, so that I could understand more accurately the kinds of you know, the historical records that I was looking through, and help people think about you know, whether or not it changes federal policy to think discursively about how we construct what it means to be indigenous versus Mexican in both places, and how that border matters in powerful ways and ways that it doesn't as well. So I use the term Avyayala, which is a kind of a term that we use in Native studies to signal. I mean, it's actually a Kuna word from an indigenous group from Panama, and it just indicates all of the Americas, what you would also call the Americas. And so it's a conversation about indigeneity that's very much hemispherically oriented, but has implications for this larger group that we're trying to work on, thinking about what is the value of doing comparative indigenous work, and what do we come to understand in this work. And to me, the end game is really thinking about relationality. How are our identities constructed in relation to each other and to other groups within our own nations and whatnot. So I got this Fulbright and went to teach for Mexico at Universidad de las Americas in Puebla. This is the state of Puebla in central Mexico, and the city of Puebla. Mexico City is about 2 hours west. And I was living in the city of Cholula, which is where Universidad de las Americas is. And I brought my my kids with me, and this is two of my kids at the UDLAP sign. And UDLAP is a private university. About half the students are on financial aid. It's a beautiful campus with an international focus, but also has a good anthropology program that is, I would say, more like an ethnic studies program in the United States than an anthropology program in the United States. So even within these disciplines, they operate differently in different countries as well. So Cholula is the oldest continuously occupied city in the Americas. It's been occupied since 500 BCE, and there are still a significant number of Nahua people who are speakers of Nahuatl. And this is the central pyramid of the city that has been grown over, and you can see some of it's been excavated here, but it was built in layers and layers over the last 2,000 years. And then when the Spanish came, of course, they built a church right on top. This is the architecture of power. And so living in Cholula, there are some very indigenous parts of everyday life. And El Popocatépetl is part of everyday life. And it's a volcano that's always erupting. So every morning walking in to teach my class or do my research, I would have the pleasure of seeing the volcano there. And this volcano is a part of the significant iconography of Mexico. So people from Mexico and the US will probably recognize these images as El Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, who are, this is El Popo from the other side, from the Mexico City side. This picture is taken, and then this is Iztaccíhuatl, and this is the story is that there's a warrior that went off to war, and he came back, and his lover thought he died, but she was so sad she died or went to sleep forever, and then he comes back, and this is the story of the mountain. So El Popo is constantly erupting, while Iztaccíhuatl is a dormant volcano. So as I went to Mexico, trying to understand, you know, the national culture of Mexico and think about these questions, some things that I came across were just kind of harmlessly odd to my American eyes, where you know, the idea of putting ketchup on pizza seemed odd to me, but Little Caesars was there, and you have ketchup packets. And then some other things, some other imports from the United States were a little bit you know, more relevant to this project, but some weird imports of US national culture images of Indians. So just driving downtown in Puebla, this is a place that does brakes on cars, and they have this Indian imagery that would feel very much in place in the United States, or in the Disney movie Peter Pan from the 1950s or whenever that was made. And then the university has an Indian mascot, the Aztecas, and there are still Nahua people who speak Nahuatl in this area. Nobody calls themselves Aztecas because that's like an ancient, it's like saying Vikings kind of, but it's still using this Indian imagery and iconography, and they do like the tomahawk chop and things at their American football games. I came to find out later, for those who are curious, I came to find out later that this was an import from the US as well, in that most Mexican sports teams don't have mascots, and that this university was founded by Anglo-Americans who came down to Mexico, and they imported the Indian mascot with them. and so this was something that I talked through with a lot of my students there as well. And then there's some really weird circulations of images, US images, that were also visible. And this one was, I was just flipping through the channels on the TV one day. And for anyone who's from the United States or Canada, you would be like, what is going on in this picture? It's so weird, because it's a mishmash of these Indian iconography and styles from different parts of the country. So this one is very much a Northwest, and this is very much a Plains. And then this is like, I think this shirt is like a reggae thing. I don't really know. And then he's got like a horse skull on a mace, and it's just a mess. But this is like a New Age religious services project. And the people have a South American accent, according to people who can tell those things. I can't really distinguish accents in Spanish, but this is what I've been told. And then there are these other representations of Indianness in national culture that I actually hope this will play through the speaker or through your speakers as well. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to stop the share for a second and redo this so that I can optimize for sharing sound. Okay, so there are these other ways that Indianness is represented in national culture, and one place is through performance or expressive culture performance at carnival celebrations, what in the US is called Mardi Gras, but carnival. And there's a historical reenactment of the Battle of Puebla, or the Battle of Cinco de Mayo, that is kind of regionally defines how it's celebrated in Puebla and nearby places like Tlaxcala and nearby. This is maybe not the best video work. I have some better video here, but this is what it looks like. So there's a bunch of different identities being performed. So there's Turks or Turcos, there's Zacapuaxtlas, which is intended to be Mexicans. There's French soldiers, there are Zapadores, and then there are Indians. So there's 5 major groups that are displayed. And this is what it looks like to perform Indianness in this pageant. 2020, just before the pandemic. Well, you might recall that right then was when the pandemic broke out and really became an international crisis. And so this is right before that happened. I was in Huejotzingo, which is an ancient city as well that predates the Spanish, and it's one of the places that has a very big carnival celebration, and thousands of people dancing the same time. So if you're from the US or from another country, you might not recognize this as performing Indianness. And so the markers, or what signifies Indianness, would be these food offerings on the backpack, as well as these nahuales, or spirit animals, so stuffed animals. So there's a hawk here, a little, I can't remember what it's called, little like raccoon tail weasel kind of thing. And then these straw hats. And some of the clothing has some imagery on it as well. This is another mode of signifying Indianness or indigeneity, which is to use these white cotton clothes and straw hats. And this is a reenactment of the first church marriage of Indigenous people. And it's another significant part of this expressive cultural historical pageantry. And this to give you a sense of, oh, I didn't put the video one on there. That's too bad. So there's thousands of people. This is one segment. Then there's row after row after row after row of other people performing other identities, and some troubling ones in terms of performing Blackness or Africanness. And then just a lot of tropes about what it means to be Indian and what it means to be non-Indian. So Mexico, as you may know, is a place where indigenous culture it's a deeply indigenous place with ancient peoples centered in national history. So this is the ball court at Xochicalco in Morelos, where they still have intact goals and all kinds of carving that you would recognize as iconic in Mexico. So indigeneity is a central part of how the nation thinks of itself, but there's also a distance from indigeneity in that it's the past rather than the present or future. One aspect of being there was a lot of field trips. The significance of place. So we went up on a field trip with most of these. So these are some of my students. These are my kids. More students, some community members. This is the partner of a faculty member. And to speak to the ways that indigeneity is constructed differently, Juan would say, like, his grandfather was Indian, spoke Nahuatl, but he won't call himself indigenous. Similarly, my wife, who's Mexican, went to a hairdresser and was talking about indigenous stuff, and this hairdresser said his mom was Indian, but he's not Indian. So this is something that in a US context would make absolutely no sense. If your mom's Indian, you're Indian. And so the ways that indigeneity is constructed, this is one of the ways that we know it's constructed, is that it's so different in these two different places. So that reveals this social construction. So there are things that are shared in common about it, but there's also local constructions. So this guy was kind of, my wife was raised in the US, but her family is still very much in Mexico and Aguascalientes. But this guy said, not only are you not indigenous, but you're not even Mexican, because he said she was raised outside the US or outside of Mexico. So this field trip that we took was to El Popo, to climb El Popo with the people of Salixintla. And this very long walk we took up the mountain. So we walked, this is already halfway up, and we were walking up there. And you can see how far we came, and everybody had to carry, came from down on that level somewhere. Everybody had to carry with us a bunch of offerings. So food for a feast, and then clothes to offer to Don Gregorio, the spirit of the mountain. And then we had the ceremony at the top. And I share this because they asked me to. The mayordomos, or the leaders, said, take pictures, take videos, and please, when you go back, tell people how we do things here. Share this with them. And so I'm fulfilling my obligation and honoring that, the gracious hosting that they did to bring us up there. So there's a lot of course, like Catholic iconography to kind of cover things up. But it was an important continuation of earlier traditions, indigenous traditions that go on to this day. So all the students in my class at UDLAP, in the regular class, were non-indigenous. And I put that in quotes because not every single one, most of them had indigenous ancestry. Some of them were from like Denmark, but most of the people there had some indigenous ancestry, as most people in Mexico do. So there are plenty of these images of Indians in Mexico. So this one, El Indito, keep in mind, Indio is a slur, a racial slur in Mexico, or it's intended as an insult to say dumb and backwards and rural. And so this kind of imagery reinforces that discourse. And this is La India Maria, who's a popular cinematic character who was in wide circulation in Mexico and one of the top performing movies of all times in Mexico. So some of the things that while teaching and learning from non-indigenous students, was that as I talked about this US context, there were things that didn't make sense as I talked about them. So I begin a Native Studies class in the US by doing a myth-busting quiz. And one of the things I talk about is this idea that Indians get free healthcare in the United States. And the thing that I teach my students in the US is, well, the myth is that it's free because everything was bought and paid for, but there is the Indian Health Service. We do have a federal program for supporting Native health. But that makes no sense in Mexico, where there's subsidized federal healthcare, nationalized healthcare. Not everybody has access to it equally, but the idea of some people have to pay thousands of dollars kind of made no sense. People were surprised that there were 574 federally recognized tribes and dozens more, if not hundreds more, non-federal communities. They were surprised by the extent of language loss in the United States, in part because with 570 plus federal tribes and others, if language is how you define indigeneity, then language loss is surprising in communities that are defined as indigenous. Genealogical indigeneity doesn't make sense in Mexico. So for someone like me, who's like a descendant of Choctaw, they would say descendant of Choctaws, maybe. But everybody in Mexico is a descendant of Indians, whether you're defined as indigenous or not. And so to build your identity on that historical connection in ways that are much more common in the United States, it doesn't make sense in the same way that to me to say my mom is Indian but I'm not would also not make sense. Another class I had a chance to teach in was the Programa de Liderazgo para Jóvenes Indígenas, which is the Indigenous Youth Leadership Program that was developed by my colleague Laura Romero and was hosted by UDLAP and funded also by the US Embassy. And they invited 30 Indigenous college students from Mexico, 5 from the US and Canada, and 5 from elsewhere in Latin America. I taught an Indigenous environmentalism class. And that one I had to teach in Spanish, which was more challenging for me. But in this, at the end of the class, at the beginning of the term, they had a thing where everybody wore their traditional clothes. And I wasn't there for that day. I didn't know that they were doing that. Otherwise, I would have showed up. But so I brought my Choctaw clothes to wear for the last day. And people were just really excited about it because the clothes are really a significant indicator of indigenous status in Mexico. And for some people, like if you don't dress like an Indian, then you're not an Indian. So there are all these different rules around what it means to be Indian and all these ways that indigeneity gets erased, or what we might call the logic of elimination, just operates in an entirely different way. So 2 of the students in this picture would not call themselves indigenous, and I defy you to tell me which ones they are, because which is kind of a way of saying, like, how do we sort out the ways that race and indigeneity are distinct in ways that in the United States, Indian and indigenous are so cleaved together that it's hard to separate them. But when we go to Mexico and start thinking about it in different ways, then we can see that indigenous is a different category from race, or indigenous status is a different category, and they intersect in the same way that gender and sexuality intersect with our other identities. So a lot of the indigenous students in Mexico had many of the same concerns and ideas and ways of thinking as indigenous students in the US. So there's still this very similar orientation that felt very much very homey. And some of the familiar problems had kind of unique contours, but a lot of similarities too. So some of the things that didn't make sense to indigenous students there, or didn't kind of register in the same way as the idea of tribes as small bounded units, as opposed to like an ethnic group spread out over an area that has a lot of different variations on language and a lot of local control, which might be more how things used to be in different parts of the US. But nonetheless, it's distinct in that there's not that same firm bureaucratically maintained boundary as there is in the US either. There are a few state supports for tribal sovereignty or for community sovereignty in the ways that they operate in the US, though there are some that have been implemented since the 1994 Accords and beyond in 2010, I want to say. So a place like Cheran in Michoacan is a place that defended their community against outsiders, against narcos, or against people who were illegally logging there, armed with an armed protection. And that's one place where sovereignty actually is protected by the government of Mexico. So another thing that did help and a lot of students that were interested in was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in particular, the idea of free, prior, and informed consent. Thinking about, if you want to do development in an area or take someone's water or take someone's wood or other natural resources, you had to have free, prior, and informed consent from the indigenous people there, which is something that, trying to bring in international law to harness it to serve their own goals would be productive, or what students thought of as productive for their communities. And every student there could name some kind of sacred places in their communities and in addition, threats to them, and important resources in their community, and in addition, threats to them. So they were very much cognizant of the specifics of their pueblo, of their community, and their ecological traditions within their communities too. So in closing, I'll just talk about the things that I wanted to talk about with this group was, what happens when we do this comparative work, and what we can do with the APRU Indigenous Studies Working Group. So this is a model that we've been using at University of Oregon, which is like a concentric circles model, or you might think of it like rings on a pond for when a duck lands or something like that. But it's this idea that we always start with the ground beneath our feet. So we operate within Kalapuya Ilihi, so the homeland of the Kalapuya people. And so we always be sure to center them. And so land acknowledgements have become common and criticized for being performative, and I get that. And at the same time, we do have to do that work of connecting, of making visible the things that settler colonialism wants to make invisible. So who are the people here? And then, we had some worries as we were thinking about this model, where we're both focused on the local and on the comparative or the relational. So local people in Oregon were very much concerned about being missing from our Native Studies program. My fear coming in as someone from Louisiana was that I couldn't, people were going to pressure me to stop working in Louisiana, which I'll never do. And people were going to say, you have to work only in Oregon, which I love making connections here. But to me, this model where every part of every circle has significance and every circle has a reason for being there, is important, so that we have, I was worried about parochialism, where we can only talk about local stuff. And other people were concerned about this big mushy middle where everything is homogenous and the same, from Louisiana to Oregon, or to New Zealand, or Aotearoa, or the Philippines. So we made an Oregon tribes requirement for our major and minor, and that people take some class focused in Oregon tribes. Then they can take whatever other classes, all kinds of other classes, but we always think of Indigenous as being a comparative category, a relational category by definition. So when we say Indigenous, what we're talking about is not just one group of people, but a relationship between at least two groups of people and a place. So Indigenous always implies that place in ways that get blocked out. So there are other categories that that also have land as a part of that story, or place as a part of that story. So Indigenous is one, immigrant is one, settler is one, Creole is one, citizen is one. All of these are not just about people, but a place and a relationship between more than one group of people, between different groups of people. So in this way, we can think about relationality as having many centers. So when we begin in other places, we come up with different stories and different ways of seeing them. Indigeneity takes many forms around the world. Certainly, even between the US and Mexico, we share this Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico, between Mexico and Louisiana. It's a thing that pulls us together and holds us together. And depending on which side of the Gulf you're starting on, you might have a different understanding of indigeneity and indigenous issues. By learning from each other, we can start to imagine new kinds of solutions and new kinds of relationships that move us around the world and help us understand indigeneity as a category, as a relationship, and think about solutions for us to move forward together. What does a good relationship look like to each other and to the land? Okay, I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Klopotek. I love the emphasis on relationality, and especially as someone, I work in a hemispheric or department, one of the departments that we pride ourselves on being hemispheric in scope. Throughout the Americas, a lot of what you shared resonates. I have some questions, but I see two hands, and so let's go to Adrian and then Fabio.
Thanks, Jessica. That was fascinating, Brian. I really enjoyed it. And like Jessica, I'm really interested in the ways in which discussions of relationality can inflect other debates that we might have beyond talking about Indigenous issues. So in particular, I wanted to ask whether you have thought or whether you think there's potential in thinking by the way in which Indigenous ideas about relationality can actually translate into debates about borders and migration. And I guess it's particularly relevant vis-a-vis Mexico, but it's obviously a big issue here in Australia as well. And I'm interested in how tapping into Indigenous ideas might actually make us think differently about sovereign borders of the nation state.
So, yeah, that's challenging, and I think to me, I haven't worked through all the ideas yet, but I think this idea of understanding who you are and where you're coming from and why you're going to a different place, or why people are coming to your place, those kind of questions are all about relationality and the ground beneath our feet. So I do think about what is it? I'll say that one thing I've thought about in this project is what does it mean? What does immigration or migration mean for Indigenous people and peoples on both the sending end and the receiving end? And so for this was one of the primary concerns of Indigenous peoples in Mexico is migration. So we have significant whole communities that nobody between the ages of 15 and 65 lives there because they've had to migrate for employment to either the US or to other parts of Mexico or Latin America or wherever. And so out-migration becomes this challenging question about indigeneity. What does it mean to be in relation to your people and your place when you're not in, what does mobility look like? So it's tied into those questions of mobility. And then on the receiving end, one of the things we think about in the US is within ethnic studies, there's very much borders are constructed, human constructions and all that kind of stuff. Yep. And then a lot of my students will advocate for fully open borders and everybody can migrate anywhere they want to. And of course, there's a part of me that's very sympathetic with that for particular people. And then there's a part of me that's also well, it's kind of inviting everybody to participate in that settler colonial project too, of displacement. So in thinking through that, one thing that we thought about was when you're coming in, establishing relation right away with the people whose territory the Indigenous people whose territory you're moving into. So this is very different than what the US immigration policy would look like, right? So it's much more about like, you have to establish a relation with the settler people. The indigenous people don't matter at all. Our opinions don't matter about anyone immigrating in, except in very rare instances with tribes that are across the border. So I think thinking about those questions of about the status of being a migrant or being an immigrant, being about a relational identity. Who are you in relation to the people and the land that you're going to, is one way to start thinking through some issues. So I don't know exactly what that looks like in Australia, but I wonder what would it mean to set up a diplomatic hub for Indigenous peoples in each region or something like that, to say, when you come here, this is how you establish your good relationship with the people whose land this is, so that you're not participating in that project. Those are my thoughts.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Fabio, is your question quick, or should we there might be time to come back to it at the end, but do you want to pose it now or in the chat?
I don't, well, I have really two. If you permit me just 1 minute, I'm really curious about this. Professor Brian, well, thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting. So given your experience being here in Mexico, I say here because I work here in Mexico, in Tampico. Did you notice, or could you notice that the differences between the problems or the issues that indigenous peoples face in the US and those that we face here, I mean, the indigenous people face here in Mexico, did you notice that sort of like the peak, or I would say the gravity of the, I would say indefension, in the sense that these indigenous people here, they lose lands to logging companies, to big ranchers, and then they sort of like here, they feel, this is what I've been told, right, by indigenous people here, that they feel a bit like helpless because they don't get like protection from the government, which in my, outside perspective, seen from what happens in the US, wouldn't be such a big problem in the US. I would say, would you say that they're very different issues in this sense?
I would say there are similar problems in both places, so that federal recognition and recognized land, maybe over the last 50 years, has helped people to be able to retain their land base. But before that, being marked as indigenous, what that's meant historically is being marked for dispossession. It signifies this is someone you can dispossess. So even in the US war with Mexico in 1846 to 1848, US politicians, Anglo politicians, were talking about Mexico as an Indian country as a way to kind of mark it for dispossession. Like they don't really have a right to keep it because they're Indian. And so, I do see that happen. So first I want to dispel the idea that being Indian has meant protection of land in the United States. Because it's really been very much the opposite, though there are those protections in place as well. And so that territoriality really matters for, if you can hold on to that land and have jurisdiction over it, that's the great part. You get to set the policies then, to an extent. In Mexico, my general sense is that people were frustrated that there wasn't this formalized boundary where they could say, this is our land, with the very important exception of Cheran. And I don't know how it played out in Chiapas after the Zapatista rebellion. But there's this, it goes back to those earlier nationalization projects, and before that, the kind of settler colonial projects of the Creole class, the Criollos in Mexico, also expropriating land to their own causes. And I see a lot of the same expectations, or a lot of the same experiences, but with unique contours. The exploitation by narcos, okay, that becomes its own thing. But we do have similar things, like we have crime on reservations too that comes in from outsiders at times. Poverty, is similar, in both places, but I would say even to an extreme in Mexico in comparison with the U.S. So the kinds of poverty and lack of access to healthcare that that kills kids. I mean, kills young people, and poverty kills everywhere, but to a greater extent, I would say, among Indigenous people in Mexico. And so, this is what I see: a lot of familiar stories that have been made unfamiliar, or that the very idea of national borders has kind of impressed upon us the idea that they're really radically different, when in fact they're just variations on a theme. This is what settler colonialism looks like. This is what expropriation looks like. And so what now we're doing, or what people have been doing, is trying to figure out tools that we could share with each other to protect against that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And if we have time at the end, let's circle back, because there's some questions in the chat as well. But for now, I'd like to move on to the second presenter, Ms. Karminn Yañgot, who is an anthropologist by passion and a development worker by profession. She teaches anthropology at the University of the Philippines, where she is concurrently earning her PhD in Indigenous Studies. Her research and development work focus on human rights and structural violence, Indigenous peoples and indigeneity, sustainable communities, political representation, and policy development. And on the side, she tends to her plants, collects ceramics, and tries her hand at vulnerable writing. So please help me welcome Ms. Karminn Yañgot.
Thank you very much, wherever you are in this part of the world. May we share the presentation? Okay, wait. Thank you. So the title of my presentation is Of Incommensurabilities and Unsettling Contexts, Indigeneity in the Philippines. Before I begin the presentation, I'd like to lay out a prolegomena. Next page, please. So this is a presentation on unsettling identity, ironically communicated in the language of the colonizer. It's intended for the marginalized. Now, I follow Manulani Alulimeyer, the Hawaiian indigenous scholar's position that while there is no word yet for epistemology, and if I may add, indigeneity, indigenous peoples in our indigenous languages, we continue to use these terms and the English language because these are the currencies that we can trade with in the academy for now. This presentation is imbued with both my search for belongingness in academia and my search for belongingness in my own community, because I come from a location of duality, one of a self-identifying indigenous woman and of a budding academic in a newly minted PhD program. This prolegomena is a disclaimer or an explanation on the personal circumstances that influence my views on research and indigeneity as articulated throughout this presentation. Next slide, please. Now, I'd like to begin the presentation with the short story from the students here in the Philippines. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, college entrance examinations to the premier state university, my university, have been deferred in favor of an assessment of secondary education credentials. Now, apparently, there is a box that you can tick if you are an indigenous person. The purpose of identifying the indigenous applicants is to sort of have a leveling off of the educational opportunities across the country. However, if you tick the box, you need to provide certain papers that prove your indigenous identity. So one of these papers is a genealogy of your descent, and another is a paper signed by the Indigenous Peoples mandatory representative of your hometown or your father's place of origin. Why it's the father's place of origin, I don't know why, but that was the answer that was given to the students who were inquiring with the government agency about this. So even if you were born, say, in the capital city, born to Indigenous parents, you still have to go to the hometown of your parent to secure this piece of paper. And if you don't, then your application as an Indigenous student will not be processed by the state university for the college admission assessment. Now, Indigenous children are put in this ridiculous situation where they have to choose. It's an either-or situation where they have to choose between reclaiming or asserting their Indigenous identity and going through the bureaucratic process of proving it, which is more often than not based on essentialist criteria, or denying their Indigenous identity and just applying for college admission like any other student from the majority population. That short story shows how problematic indigeneity is in the Philippines. So who should define Indigenous peoples in the Philippines is as problematic as who is Indigenous here in the country. Now, when asked who the Indigenous peoples in the Philippines are, there would be a multitude of answers because there is no survey of Indigenous peoples in the country. There are estimates, but these are not reliable. What is sure is they peg it to at least 10 to 20% of the population. So in a population of 110, Indigenous peoples would be around 10 to 20 million. And that's not the end of celebrating indigeneity in the Philippines. The country, in fact, is one of the three in Southeast Asia which uses it's the only country in Southeast Asia which uses the term Indigenous peoples, and one of the three in Asia which defines Indigenous peoples as peoples under international law. So we have the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, which is hailed as a progressive law for the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands. So the country has been praised in several fora for this law. Why? Because some states in Southeast Asia refuse to recognize Indigenous peoples within their territories. According to these states in Southeast Asia, everyone is Indigenous because everyone was here before the colonizers came. Therefore, if we were to base it on aboriginality or priority in time, then everyone is native to Southeast Asia. So the fact that the Philippines has the 1997 Indigenous Peoples Rights Act makes it something that is celebrated across the region. But as the next page would show, next page please, having the IPRA is not necessarily making life better for Indigenous peoples. Next slide please. Because Indigenous peoples continue to suffer from marginalization, dispossession, and development aggression. So using your Indigenous identity to forward a cause can cost you your life or can endanger your life. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because we have this law, the situation in the Philippines is better. Next slide, please. If we would look at the law, this is how it defines Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. It bases the definition of indigeneity on ascription, on the principle of time immemorial occupancy, on ethnicity, on resistance to colonization, on historical differentiation, and historical continuity with pre-colonial institutions. If you look at these different criteria, they're largely Eurocentric. They're largely based on the concept of indigeneity as constructed in the Northern Hemisphere. When translated to the situation of the Philippines, of Southeast Asia, of Asia in general, they're not necessarily commensurate. Next slide, please. So in the discourse of indigeneity in the Philippines, like I said earlier, it's largely Eurocentric. So the concept has its origins in the colonial historical perspective. When we apply the concept of indigeneity in the United States, in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, it doesn't create confusion. But if you apply it to the concept of the Philippines, it creates confusion because it assumes that someone was here first. And that's not the case here in the Philippines, because prior to colonization, everyone was coexisting with each other. Now, next slide, please. Even if we look at history, history cannot state with final certitude who was first here in the territory. Here, like some states argue everyone is indigenous and therefore no one fits the indigenous peoples category. Now, why is the category very problematic or very contentious in Southeast Asia? It's because of the rights that are attached to being indigenous peoples. So it includes the recognition of indigenous rights to ancestral lands, ancestral domains. It includes the freedom to determine their political trajectory, their cultural trajectory, their economic development as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, the peoplehood of indigenous peoples has implications on rights, and it's largely dependent on the recognition of the state. So just to reiterate, in settler colonies, in historically settler colonies, it's easy to determine who is indigenous and who is not. In settler colonies, it's the concept of we were here first. It's a tenable argument on defining who is indigeneity. But in the Philippines, like I said earlier, that's not the case. So in such a sense, all the people in the region are natives. And if everyone is natives, then who are to be afforded rights under international and national legislation? Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to point out here is that the Eurocentric conceptions of indigeneity, which are transported to the Philippine context, are very inharmonious with the case of the Philippines. The land dispossession of indigenous peoples here was not committed by settlers, not committed by white people, but by the early inhabitants of the Philippines as well. So even if there is a definition of indigenous peoples in state law, which is the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, it is not without controversy. This state law, the IPRA, still adheres to priority in time and confinement of indigenous cultures to pre-colonial traditions. So if you don't look indigenous, if you don't live in places which are how do we say this, associated with indigenous populations, if you don't practice indigenous traditions, then you are no longer indigenous. We have to point out that indigeneity as a source of identity is a confluence of histories, experiences, prior to contact with external forces and colonization, and of paths of decolonization and independence after the development of nation states, coupled with the present pressing structural circumstances. So what we are trying to forward here in this presentation is that in the specific context of the Philippines, what sets indigenous peoples apart from the majority non-indigenous population is the experience of structural oppression. When we say structural oppression, it is violence within and by the state. It refers to development aggression or the aggression, exploitation, and dispossession experienced by indigenous peoples because of extractive industries, extractive projects with the imprimatur of the state. It also includes commodification, subjugation, and segregation, again with the imprimatur of the state. And it also includes epistemological violence in the sense that when the state perpetuates images of indigenous peoples in educational materials, which are supposed to be purveyors of knowledge, and result in the erasure, double erasure of indigenous peoples. They cause epistemological violence in that way. Next slide, please. Now, therefore, how do we define who is indigenous in the Philippines? Just like what I said earlier, it's structural oppression, because every instance of indigeneity can be attributed to oppression, but oppression does not always produce indigeneity in all instances. This oppression that we are forwarding as the determining factor has to be tied to the histories, experiences, and relations of Indigenous peoples. And this kind of definition of Indigenous peoples belies the conventional understandings of indigeneity heavily anchored on the principle of priority in time, or aboriginality, and historical continuity with pre-colonial societies and institutions. Next slide. Okay, so how then do we approach this? We are proposing an adoption of Benedict Kingsbury's constructivist approach, where the four important criteria are self-identification. So it's important for Indigenous peoples to say that we are Indigenous. It's also important for others to recognize this distinct identity. Second, this experience of oppression. Again, like I noted, not just oppression, but structural oppression. Third, the long connection with the region. Because if we look at the situation of the Philippines, it's not an isolated instance of indigeneity. It's connected to the Southeast Asian region, which historically, as we know, is home to a lot of interactions between and among nation states, as we know now. And fourth, the wish to retain or to perpetuate this distinct identity as Indigenous people. So we forward that these four criteria are the most tenable in defining who is Indigenous in the Philippines. And the final slide, please. Okay. Like we said, the struggle for self-determination is one that is shared by all Indigenous peoples in the world. But even if we have parallelisms in terms of experiences of dispossession, marginalization, and subjugation, there are particular contexts which apply only to place-based identities like that of the Indigenous peoples here in the Philippines. So to end, we would argue that Indigenousness in the Philippines is rooted in structural oppression based largely on the material basis of Indigenous identity, as in the land and the resources found within it, and not so much on aboriginality and continuity with pre-colonial cultures. So we're not doing away here with the historical context, with the relations harbored in the past. We're just saying that that has to be melded with the present experience of structural oppression so that we can have a more clear-cut definition of who is Indigenous in the Philippines and who is not. So yeah, that ends my presentation. I'd be happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Karminn. I'm really struck by what I'm hearing as connections between you and Brian's presentations in terms of what I might say are the particularities between Anglo-colonization and Iberian colonization, that there are different structures that are put in place that in some ways, when we talk about place-based identities, and in the US context, based on blood, based on genealogies and things that are used to separate us, to exclude us, to put us on reservations or in villages or in pueblos, aren't necessarily what I've heard either of you talk about in terms of being rather incorporated into nation-state machineries, in terms of whether it's slavery or encomienda, or rather than being marked for dispossession in the ways that we are in these Anglo states. I'm wondering if there's anything there between getting more specific about the kinds of colonization that make these things different possible. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, Karminn or Brian, if you wanted to speak to that. Coming from a place that's also dealing with Russian colonization and French colonization, that brings in a whole other bucket of worms. But what is common between, I think, Spanish and Catholicism in both of these areas is really interesting.
Karminn, I'll leave that to you.
Well, I think for the case of the Philippines is more of a internal colonialism, in the sense that the oppression suffered by the indigenous peoples in the country is not necessarily by the white settlers, but by other Filipinos as well. So if we look at these instances of land grabbing here, it's still largely land based and resource based. But if we look at the instances of dispossession here, they're by the hands of the same Filipinos who, if we trace the historical peopling of the Philippines, all of us were early inhabitants of the Philippines. So the divide between indigenous peoples who are assumed to be highlanders and the non-indigenous population who are called lowlanders was created to make the expansion, or not the expansion, but it was created to divide and conquer by the Spanish colonizers. So it wasn't really there, in the sense that it's not comparable to the situation in the Northern Hemisphere. Like, okay, we'll drive you away from the land and we'll settle here, we'll live here with you. In the Philippines, that wasn't the case. They left, but they left institutions which were perpetuated by Filipinos as we know now. So in a sense, it's more of an internal colonialism, but I don't know if it's applicable. If my usage of the term is right.
I think there's a lot of interesting elements there of connection, and one that I think connects is Shannon Speed did this interesting article on settler colonialism in Mexico, where it was like this idea, well, you know, it may not be Spanish controlled anymore, but it was still Spanish control in Mexico, like controlled by Spanish people or Spanish institutions. And so I like the way, Karminn, that you said they left these institutions in place, and people, you know, harnessed those institutions to extract wealth from other communities that are, you know, those place-based elements and culturally based elements. Those are all, you know, very powerful ways of thinking. And I think this has been one of the challenges of thinking about global Indigenous studies is, you know, what is Indigenous in each place? So in the US, like, you know, like Karminn said, we have this very sharp racial distinction between Europeans and Native Americans at the beginning, at least, if not so much anymore, at all times anyway. But you know, it becomes more challenging to think about, you know, South Africa. So people who are the San people in South Africa would call themselves indigenous in relation to, I don't know, Bantu speaking people. And it's not like someone came from somewhere else, but what does it mean? What is indigeneity? What are we signaling by this word? And I've heard of people having similar conversations in Sweden and Norway, like to be Sami by descent. I mean, everybody is Sami by descent there, sort of, you know? So is Sami really, does it really mean a way of life? Or does it mean a genealogy? Or does it mean a language and culture? So these are the challenges of sorting through what any kind of relational indigeneity might look like. And it's automatically a relational category by virtue of being so different in so many different places. You know, yeah.
I think I'm also thinking about Shannon Speed's settler capitalism, and just thinking about how different structures of capitalism and slavery certainly work, and how she talks about it in Mexico, but then knowing what I know in terms of slavery throughout the West Coast. I mean, very much in California and Alaska for sure, those being the context I'm more familiar with of native slavery. Being from Spanish colonialism. So it's just an interesting thing that I'm a far northerner, so it's not exactly in my experience, except for my husband's family, who is Apache from the southwest of New Mexico. So I've also just kind of thinking about how you phrased it, Karminn, the incommensurability of Eurologics or European ways of defining these terms, when really I think, Brian, what your work, and Karminn, what your work both of your work, thinking about them together, is really arguing for kind of diving down to the root of how people explain, not define, but explain. And that's something, that distinction of even that English language, those words of defining versus explaining, is really important. And that's Renee Pulani-Lewis, Kanaka Hawaii scholar, who I first heard that distinction from, in terms of thinking about, when we try to be too rigid, that's what policy does, right? That's what laws do, is they nail things down, and then you have to litigate or argue whether you're in or out of those definitions. And so I'm really appreciative of both of the presentations, complicating that and being the theme of unsettling. Are there other questions for Karminn? For those of you that are still here, feel free to unmute or type a question into the chat. Or we can even have, Brian, if you have a question for Karminn, crosstalk amongst the presenters.
Well, I'll just say I appreciated that consideration of like, well, what is it? What do we mean by this term in each context? Because it is challenging in sorting through the modes of recognition at a group level, at an individual level, and how those infiltrate the ways we think about ourselves in relation to each other and in relation to other peoples. Those become powerful mediating factors on identity and state power.
I guess Karminn,
Yeah,
there's a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Karminn.
Because I've always been problematizing on, because I want to discuss these issues of Indigenous peoples with Indigenous peoples, but it has always been difficult for me to translate words like colonization, words like Indigenous peoples, decolonization, self-determination. So there's a lot to say about these concepts in English, but when I try to talk about it with Indigenous women or Indigenous men, it makes it difficult for me to express what I really want to talk about. Like if I say, can we talk about self-determination in your terms? And it would take me an entire afternoon thinking of how to break down these concepts. Because there, for example, in my language, Tantanay, there is no word for colonization. Neither is there a word for Indigenous peoples. So how do I talk about these experiences with them and try to translate them in English so that we can discuss it in the greater academic community? So there's a lot of incommensurabilities for me in that area alone. So yeah, that's what unsettles me so much about the academic discourse on indigeneity.
Well, I'll say that even for English speakers, like trying to use the word indigeneity, at one point, I remember, being down in Louisiana and talking with people, and my friend who has a master's degree in history was like, is that a word, indigeneity? And like, this is a native guy, deeply immersed in his tribal culture. And so these are even new words for English language speakers. So they're conceptually loaded and unclear. So this is part of the work, is sorting through what do those things mean.
In relation to, Yesenia posted a question in the chat about that. I'm just kind of glossing it in how I want to pose it to both you, Brian, and Karminn, in terms of how these studies become institutionalized, or how they live not only in U.S. institutions, but also I'd love to hear from you, Karminn, about the program that you're in. Brian, your program just recently added Indigenous to the list of race and ethnicity, and I know that that's becoming more of a thing to really talk about the particularities of indigeneity or Indigenous peoples as, yes, raced or racialized, and yes, perhaps also understood as ethnicized or ethnic, but that Indigenous is becoming something that is institutionalized in a way to talk about the particularities of Indigenous peoples everything from struggles to their structures, right?
Yeah, and it's, oddly enough, my department decided that to change its name while I was in Mexico. And it's kind of something I came back to. But it is a recognition of something that I've been telling my colleagues for a very long time, which, just the idea of indigeneity being a separate or a distinct social vector from race. This was an idea that came to me by somebody who was talking about immigration or immigrant status as one of those other intersecting vectors. And that made a lot of sense to me because I had a German student at the time who had immigrated from Germany to the US and was talking about herself as an immigrant working as a maid in a hotel, and kind of making that equivalent to immigrants from Central America or Mexico or wherever. And I was struggling with it. I was like, there's something unique about that immigrant status, but it also, the way that it intersects with race, it isn't the same experience, and so that was one of the aha moments for me. But Yesenia asked as well, like, how do you think about why is anthro different than ethnic study, or more like ethnic studies? And I'll say ethnic studies is more action oriented or political. And I think anthropology in the US has a tendency, it's not exclusively, but has a tendency to be, have these colonial roots. It has colonial roots of exoticizing and kind of the making the folkloric be the center, and then kind of containing indigenous identities within this distant past. Whereas I think anthropology in Mexico has been more action oriented in terms of service, but it also has a little bit of that, a lot of non-Indian, Indian experts being the people that the federal government goes to for to answer questions, and as opposed to talking with people themselves. And so it seemed to me that the students that I had in anthropology at ULA were understood how race and power and indigeneity operated with each other in ways that ethnic studies teaches and native studies teaches. And so I think I did talk with them about it, and they were interested to hear about both how I defined anthropology in the US and how I defined ethnic studies there too. So like, this is one of my struggles with anthropology as an anthropology undergrad, was like, they wouldn't talk about racism and power as being factors in Native lives. And so there's like this kind of, this ethnographic gaze kind of thing, and that's it. So.
Yeah, Karminn, would you like to talk a little bit about maybe what you're hopeful for? Like, what will the program that has just begun at your university, the kinds of work that you're interested in doing moving forward, or that maybe your mentors are doing in the Indigenous Studies program there? What are your hopes going forward?
My main hope, perhaps, is for us to have more scholarship by Indigenous peoples in the Philippines, because it's understandable why at present we continue to read a lot of materials on Kansas, the situation of Indigenous peoples in Kansas, and little about the situation of Indigenous peoples or the identity making or the peoplehood of Indigenous peoples here in the Philippines. So I'm looking forward to reading more of that. In terms of our the mentorship provided by our professors, I think it was a good thing that we were assigned a visiting professor from Canada, Professor Caroline Podrucci, as a historian by practice. I think it was a good thing that she handled that course, because she laid out to us the situation of Indigenous peoples in settler colonies. That gave us a backdrop of how the situation of indigeneity or indigenousness is different here in the Philippines. So yeah, basically looking forward to more local scholarship on the issues.
Great. And are there any other questions, burning questions for now? Looking through, there's some great conversation in the chat. If anybody wants to bring anything forward, please
I
don't
can
be shy.
answer Adrian's question about the archive. And so this was an archive that they collected themselves through the years, and they submitted a petition for acknowledgement, an initial petition in 1998. And then the Office of Federal Acknowledgement sent back a response. And so the chief at the time, John Procell, asked me to come and talk with them about federal acknowledgement, and they said, go take these and make copies and see what you can do with it. And so that was the archive. It's one that they created, and they maintain the document there. I think the federal government probably has has that set of documents. I have that set of documents, and I don't know who else, but there are certainly more documents that are needed. That's for the future, generating the archive rather than assuming it's already there, right?
And if there's, I'll pose a similar question to you then, Brian, as a closing. Are there things that you're looking forward to doing as the next phase of what you've presented? Are there hopes that you have in terms of helping untangle everything that Choctaw Apache people are facing?
Yeah, I think for my own goal is to I've lost a little bit of faith in the federal acknowledgement process through the years, and so my intervention, I hope, is more ideological, for people to think about, what does indigeneity mean and look like in a range of ways and places. And so I'm actually working on these other elements of expressive culture. So I can't wait to go back to Huejotzingo for Carnival and to Tlaxcala. And I know that our colleagues in Chiapas were going to have us down for maybe Day of the Dead sometime, or something along those lines. And so I'm just working on this expressive culture project. And one thing I hope to do, so I taught a natives and film class based in the US while I was in Mexico, and based on US tribes. And I'm hoping to do another class on indigeneity in Mexican cinema and teach it with natives, the students in the Indigenous Youth Leadership Program there. And here, kind of co-create an article about it or something along those lines to say, how are we thinking together collectively as about these images from Mexican cinema and Indigenous cinema.
Fantastic. Well, Jackie, I'll pass it to you for closing announcements.
Sure. I'm really glad that you mentioned the trip to Chiapas later this year by the APRU working group. We're really excited to be announcing that very soon, so please stay tuned for those details. But also, I want to make sure that everyone knows that we have one more session of the series coming up on inclusive education, which is on June 24th. And it's presented by our colleagues at Universitas Gajah Mada, which is in Indonesia, and Massey University from the Cook Islands. So I'd really love for all of you to attend and learn from each other and really have this really great exchange that we've already been having, as you've seen today. So I would just want to thank all of the presenters and thank everyone for attending and giving your input. And hope to see you next time.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your night or day.
Yes.